Hey, Dino with Apigee. I want to talk to you about OAuth and demonstrate a few things. This is the OAuth RFC. Section 4.3 talks about the password grant and how that works. Now, password grant is going to be useful when the user trusts the client or the app, and that might be the case when, for example, it's an employer-issued app. An employee is using it, and the employee implicitly trusts the app. In that case, we can use a password grant flow in order to obtain a token, and the way it works is the client ID and client secret are encoded in HTTP basic mode, so that's just base 64 with the concatenated with a colon, and then we pass this kind of payload in a form URL encoded format, and we get a token back. So let's have a look at what that would look like with Apigee Edge. So let me flip over to an Apigee Edge instance. I've got an API proxy here with a couple of different endpoints. The first one is an OAuth dispensary that supports the password grant flow, and the second is going to be a resource endpoint where we'll include some verification of the tokens that have been issued. So both of those are included in the same proxy bundle, both of those endpoints, and let me just walk you through what that looks like. So for the token issuance, we've got a proxy endpoint, and I've got token dispenser flow, and it's pretty simple. It's got a couple of different policies. First thing it's going to do is verify that the request is valid, that the grant type is password. That's the only one that's supported. Then we're going to validate the user. Now, this one, I'm using a mock user authentication service that's just built into the API proxy itself and implemented in JavaScript, and I can show you that down here. We've got a user database that includes usernames and password hashes, and then some group information, groups that the user is that is attached to the user identity. So we're going to validate the username and password that's been passed in with the request against that information. Now, normally this is going to be a remote service. It's going to be LDAP or some other authentication service, but just for the purposes of the demonstration, we're going to include it in the API proxy itself. We've got some checking. Did the authentication fail? If it did, we'll get an error message back. Next thing we want to do is map the set of groups that is associated to each user to a set of scopes that will be attached to the token. Now, how did I do that? Again, that's probably going to be in the real world a microservice, but what I've done is just embedded in another JavaScript callout inside the API proxy. So what I've got here is a map between group names and scopes that will be attached to the token that's issued for a user that has that group attached to it in the authentication database. And I'm just taking the union of all the scopes for the groups that each particular user has. So once I do that, so I authenticate the user and then map the groups attached to that user to a set of scopes, and then mint a token. Let's have a look at what that looks like. Basically, this is just an OAuth v2 policy, and we use the generate access token operation. We'll set some expiry of the actual token and the refresh token. And then here is where we specify the context variable that contains the scopes that the token will be minted with. All right, so that's the OAuth token dispensary endpoint, and fully configurable. You can modify this to insert an LDAP lookup or an Active Directory lookup or some other lookup for the user authentication. The second endpoint in this API proxy is what I'm calling the resource endpoint. That's the thing that's going to verify tokens. So I've got a number of different flows here, each one verifying a token with a different scope. So let's have a look at this one. This one verifies a token that has scope of named scope-01. Now, I want to point out that the scope names are entirely up to you, the API designer. You, when you configure the generate access token policy, can specify which scopes are attached to that token, and you get to just invent those names. At verify time, that's what we're doing here on this resource endpoint, you specify the scope that you want to verify on the token. If the token is valid, not expired, and has this scope, has the configured scope, then this verification will succeed. If it does not have the scope, or if it is expired, then this verification will not succeed. And you can see I've got different flows, each of which verifies the token, but with a different scope. And that's just to exercise the, or to demonstrate the variation in tokens and so on. So those are the two endpoints in the API proxy. Let's have a look at what this looks like at runtime. And I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll go over to the trace window and start a trace session on this API proxy. Then I'm going to bring up Postman, which is a REST client. I'm going to import a collection, and let's import, let's see, I think I want this one, the most recent one. And what that gives me is a couple of different requests that request tokens, and then some that exercise the resource endpoint that verifies the token. So let's start with this one. We'll request a token, and you can see it's a post. And we've got the headers. This basic auth header encodes the client ID and secret, which is as per spec, as per the OAuth spec in the RFC. And because it's password grant, what we have to do is pass the username and the password in the body of the post. And we're going to post it to this endpoint, this path. And I've provisioned it on this organization. So when I send that, what you'll see is Apigee Edge is receiving the request. It's going to verify the client ID and secret that's encoded in the basic auth header. It's also going to verify the user credentials. And because everything is valid, we're getting a token that has these scopes, which are associated to the user. Let's look at the trace window, and we'll see what happened. The request came in. You can see in the trace window, this is the body that came in. You can also see the authorization header is masked here because those are generally secrets. We skipped the check for the invalid grant type because it was a valid grant type. In the validate user, yes, we did find that the user was valid, and this is the set of groups. We checked that the authentication was successful. Then we map that group to a set of scopes, and then later mint a new token with those scopes, and then finally respond back to the caller. And that's what you see in this payload here. With Apigee Edge, you, the API designer, have the ability to curate the API so that you can send back more or less information. I've been quite verbose in the token response here and included a whole bunch of information about the token. Not necessary for you to have a token response be so verbose. In fact, you could just send back the access token and maybe the list of scopes, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all you want to do. But what I've done is just been somewhat elaborate just for the purposes of the demonstration. All right, so we've got an access token, and you can see some of the other metadata associated to this, the issue time, the expiry time, and so on. And the authenticated users all attached to that. So let's just grab the access token. We'll copy that, and I'll go over to a different resource where I can exercise the resource endpoint that allows me to verify the token. So I'm going to paste that into the authorization header, just a bearer token. And I'll send that in, and what you'll see is a successful response back, which means we still have the trace running, so I should be able to see that here. What it means is we've verified the token, and because it was valid and it had the appropriate scopes, in other words, it had scope 01, then we'll get a success response back. Now, let me flip back over to Postman, and we'll try a different resource. This one verifies a different scope on the token, and the scope that we've it's going to verify scope 2, I think. So we'll check that out in the trace window. This one is verifying scope 2, and because the token has scope 2 as well, then that's going to work just fine. Let me go back over to Postman, and we'll get a different token now for a different user that has a different set of scopes. This one is for Evgeny, so we'll send that in, and you can see I don't have scope 01 or 02 here. But it is a valid token. So we've got the token. Let's grab that, and we'll again exercise the verification endpoint, paste in that token, send it, and what I should see at this point is a rejection, where Apigee Edge is verifying, yes, the token's valid, but it doesn't have the appropriate scope for this particular request. And flipping over into the trace window, you can see that's happening right here in the verify access token policy. So what this shows you is that you can have a single API endpoint with a number of different operations, each of which verifies an OAuth token with different scopes, if you like. Those scopes can be associated to the token based on the user's identity and other metadata asserted about the user by the user authentication service. I've demonstrated it with a mock user authentication service, but it's very easy to plug this into an LDAP, an Active Directory, or some other user authentication service. So that's it. That's OAuth 2.0 password grants with scopes, and I hope you like it.